Hey friend, in this video, I'm gonna be going through the differences between hot press paper and cold press paper with watercolor. So I'm actually gonna show you the difference on paper. So the same brand, the same series of paper, but just cold press versus hot press. So I'm gonna talk about the differences between each paper, when I would use hot press versus cold press paper, and then I talk about my preference, which is cold press, and why I prefer working with watercolor on cold press paper versus hot press. So if you've been curious about the difference between the two types of papers, when to use hot press versus cold press or vice versa, then this video is for you. So let's dive in. Okay, so I have here both Legion Papers, Stonehenge Aqua paper, but the block of paper that I have is their cold pressed version, and then this loose sheet that I tore from a really large sheet is from the hot press. So you will find a variety of artists working on hot press paper. You'll find a variety of watercolor artists working on cold press paper. The main difference or reason why you would choose one over the other is preference, or if you're doing something where you're wanting more like smooth coverage, in a different outcome, then you could use hot press versus cold press. The reason why I pretty much only work on cold press paper is because during the pressing process of the paper, the toothy texture stays in the paper. So it's more textured, which helps to grab and hold on to the loose water and pigment while it's drying. You can mix a lot more colors and washes together without getting too many hard lines on cold press paper. And hot press paper is completely smooth. If you are doing something that has mixed media, like if you're doing watercolor and inking on top of it with some pens or calligraphy, then I would suggest going with hot press paper because it's smooth, which is helpful for when you're writing on paper. But I love the way the cold press paper grabs my pigment, grabs my brush as I'm painting, and it just feels like things cover more smoothly or mix together more smoothly than on hot press paper. So for example, when I do a large stroke on my hot press paper, you can see it kind of already starting to form some areas where there'll be hard lines. So you just have to pay attention to that a little bit more on hot press paper. And then on the cold press paper, I'll do the same thing, a stroke with Scarlet Lake across, and you're gonna get more smoother coverage. You're also gonna get this texture though. So if that's not something that you want and you want a smoother looking stroke, then hot press paper is gonna give you that. But if you like this texture with the toothiness kind of showing through that stroke, then you'll want the cold press paper. Or let's say we are mixing colors together. So maybe some manganese blue and lemon yellow deep. See how color separates on the two different papers. So when you lay down the mixed color, does the yellow separate from the turquoise, or does it stay mixed well? And then same thing over here with our cold press paper. Just kind of a smoother look, in my opinion, on cold press than hot press. I like this look a lot better, but that's my preference. Then I'm gonna do some wet and wet bleeding, see what the difference is between cold press and hot press. So as these circles are drying too, I'm noticing how they're blending. So this burst or bloom happening between this darker and lighter turquoise circle, I like a lot better than what happened on the hot press paper. However, I love what is happening on this stroke on the hot press paper, the little kind of spider web texture, the veins on it, and it's a really smooth stroke in comparison to the cold press one. There's just kind of an even color, not much gradient going on. And then we obviously have this chunky texture at the bottom because the toothy paper. I mean, if you keep playing with both papers, seeing how things dry and what you like, what your preference is, there's nothing wrong with working on cold press paper versus hot press or vice versa. It's all about your own preference. And then there's obvious reasons for choosing one over the other. Like if you're going to add any sort of lettering or line work or illustration work with a pen, it'll be a lot easier because the paper is smoother on hot press paper. But if you have a steady hand and you're able to do it on cold press paper, then you can also do it on cold press paper. So there's definitely different results here and there with hot press versus cold press, but play with it, do a few exercises and see what you prefer. These blooms, like I mentioned already, my favorite part of watercolor, are a lot easier to achieve than with hot press paper, because with hot press paper, there's no like toothiness to stop the gradient from blending in so much. And so for here, it's more obvious like bloom happening, which I like. This red is a little bit richer than the cold press paper. Not sure why that is. And same thing with the orange. They're just a little bit brighter on the hot press paper. So if you prefer that, or you're okay with how the colors dry on cold press paper, so play around with it, see what you prefer. Just keep in mind with hot press paper, you're gonna have to be a little bit more patient with how things dry and making sure you're working out any sort of hard lines. If you're working with too much water on hot press paper, it's gonna be very obvious because there's gonna be a lot of blobs, a lot of hard lines around those blobs. Cold press paper is a little bit more forgiving with hard lines. So if you see a lot of hard lines in your work, it could be the paper that you're using is a little too smooth for the way you work with the amount of water that you work, or we should change the amount of water you work with. There you have it. Couple differences, couple preferences when talking about using hot press or cold press. So it's really up to you as an artist to decide which one is for you. If you're using something where you're wanting to paint a really big gradient wash with smooth color cover, then maybe you'll want to work with hot press paper over cold press if you don't want that texture showing through. But if you want that texture, see, there's so many different varieties of decisions to make. So practice with it, play with it, see what your kind of preferences are, and I hope you had fun learning these things. Comment below with your experiences with both. Let me know which is your preference, whether it's hot press or cold press, and maybe why. I'd love for people to go through these comments and maybe get us a few extra tips. So thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.